We are live, episode 16. Can you believe it, Liam? We've been together now more than 16 weeks because we took a little bit of a
Oh,
hiatus
yeah.
from Office Hours with J&L. But we're excited about this episode. Well, we're excited about every episode, but specifically this one because we have Riley Livermore, former Air Force officer who's with us today. And I'm going to have him talk about why he joined the military, kind of his journey in Israel, because this conversation is specifically about his experiences in Israel. And one of the reasons we wanted to have Riley, for many reasons, but he resigned over what's been happening in Gaza as a result of the genocide that's been imposed by the Israeli government, who the Western media denies at all fronts. But I'm excited to have him because Liam, I heard him on one of the lives on TikTok about a couple of weeks ago, and I said, well, we have to have him on this episode. We have to talk to Riley because there's more to Riley than just the Air Force. I recognize he's an emotional guy, really vulnerable, and I thought, what a great episode to have with Riley to hear about his experiences. I gave a snippet of who you are, Riley. I would love for you to take a deep dive into your journey from 2008 and on, and your experience, and then we'll go from there. How does that sound?
Yeah, it sounds great. Jamal, Liam, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, welcome.
Chat with you guys. So I think my story kind of starts when I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. Grew up next to Luke Air Force Base, so it's a fighter Air Force base. So I grew up seeing F-16s flying over. Thought it was super cool. Both my grandfathers served. My one grandfather was a fighter pilot in Vietnam. He actually, gave his life for our country, not kind of indirectly. He got Agent Orange. He got leukemia and died before I was born. So I kind of very much from an early age grew up in the shadow of an Air Force base, kind of the heritage. Like my grandfather gave his life for Vietnam, so that weighed really heavily on me. And then I was in 7th grade when September 11th happened, and so that was just, it all kind of came together. That's when I decided, hey, I want to serve my country, go to the Air Force. And that kind of kicked off that transition. I loved airplanes. I loved engineering. I thought I wanted to fly, but I realized I wanted to be an engineer in the Air Force instead, which was neat in one regard. I think because if I would have gotten a pilot, I think I would have been a lot more operational. I don't know how that might path been very different. But because I went engineering, a lot of engineering is in the acquisitions career field. So I spent a lot of time doing research and development type work, focusing on autonomy, small UAS type stuff. And that actually opened up a door for an exchange where I was able to go to Israel for 2 years. I went to Haifa and did a 2-year exchange up at the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. So I was there from 2016 to 2018, which was a really exciting time to be in Israel just because that was the election of Donald Trump, right? That was the embassy moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That was the canceled Iran nuclear deal. So, on so many different dimensions, and I think we'll talk about a lot of them. Obviously, there was the geopolitical one. I think I really saw for the first time kind of Israel and how Israel played into American domestic politics. That was really interesting for me. Also, I got a peek behind the curtain as someone in the Air Force, but I was attached to the State Department, so I got insight into the State Department and how kind of diplomacy works. I was working out of the embassy, or attached to the embassy. And then also my background, I grew up in a Christian evangelical white context. And so living in Israel, kind of the Holy Land, I identified as evangelical Christian at the time. So just seeing the sites and kind of experiencing that as well was incredibly eye-opening to me. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can keep talking. I'm sure there's a lot of questions here. We kind of run through the whole thing and we'll go back. Does that work for you, or what do you want?
We can bounce around a little bit.
Okay.
Honestly, it might seem like a tangent, especially given the kind of thing that Jamal wants to get into here. But I'm kind of curious. Okay, so the experience of visiting Israel, Palestine, as an evangelical Christian and seeing things, like the experience of seeing the different sites. I think that's something that a lot of people might be able to relate to as well. And I think maybe from that, if there's anything that you notice that seemed a little off as well, because I've had the same kind of things where I've gone and I've seen a bunch of the different religious sites. I've gone looking at Muslim, Christian, and Jewish religious sites, and attended services in different places. Like walking the Via Dolorosa. There's all kinds of things you want to go and see because they're such an important part of the historical canon that we grow up with. So it's neat to actually be in those places. But in many of them, my experience of people was often peculiar. And it started a lot of questions from me. I went in with a decent chunk of knowledge because I was a graduate student my first time visiting the country. But I learned so much just on the ground, interacting with people, like picking up different things. So I'm curious what stood out to you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The thing I always roll my eyes because these Christian tour groups like the Blitzkrieg through, they get off the bus, get on the bus, get off the bus, get on the bus. You kind of get whisked from site to site to site, and it's very curated, right? Like you go in the West Bank and you go to the Church of Nativity, and you don't see anything, you don't see the wall. Like there's a lot of like you don't really see the country. Like it's this weird. It's like kind of, we call it Christian Disneyland to some degree, of like you go to all these different rides, but you never really get to feel the real country. And so I think the thing living there was so cool was that you kind of could take time, you could go off the beaten path. And that's the stuff I almost enjoyed the most, right? We went to the old city in Jerusalem and I was so tired. The first time we went there was with like a hotel tour, right? Where they take you to all like, these can spots and the Jewish quarter, and they take you to like the very like touristy, kitschy places. And so we found this guy. We knew someone who was a Palestinian Christian who grew up in the old city. He's like, you got to check out this place. It makes the best hummus, right? This guy like hand grinds the chickpeas. Like 5 generations was there since before the occupation. And those are things like, this is super, super cool, right? We're in this mom and pop shop kind of tucked away in the old city, chatting with this guy. He's kind of explaining how he's been generations of making hummus in Jerusalem. Like that's the stuff that I fell in love with all over. It's like, it's not the kind of this is where Jesus did whatever. It was kind of getting to know the people, getting to know the culture. And so I think that's something, living there was really cool. I also think we had friends before we left who were Palestinian American. And so they were able to kind of pull us aside and be like, hey, listen, you're going to get a very heavy Zionist kind of pitch when you're there, especially through the State Department and kind of, a lot of your Israeli Jewish friends. And so like, here's kind of the other side of the story. And so I think that kind of inoculated me a little bit from just like having my eyes peeled, or my ears kind of open as far as hearing different talking points and stuff. And like, that doesn't sound quite right. Like, stay away from the Muslim quarter in the old city of Jerusalem, or don't go here. That's a bad part of town. And you're just like, I don't think it just kind of like, you could start to see how that propaganda. And I think it really affected people who were there visiting kind of these short-term trips. Cause like, oh, well, that's dangerous, right? The whole kind of, Islamic men, Muslim men are terrorists, right? That's like, it was obviously just below the surface, but that was kind of very much, I noticed that in a lot of regards of my time there.
There are so many things there that I can relate to. I mean, for me, traveling, I hate the curated tour stuff too. And just being able to go somewhere, just sit on a bench, listen to people, watch the streets, go into the different restaurants, try and chat people up, just, hey, I'm going to sit here and like have a bunch of backgammon games going on. I'm just like, hey, like, how's it going? We're going to have tea. You get much more of a feel for things. And it really, a lot of times you do have to go well off the beaten path to do that. And this is true not only for American Christians going, but also for American Jews, both with like package tours and with the birthright stuff. They are herded along very particular paths to avoid really problematic areas for the overall narrative. And they want to frame things in such a way that, oh, well, the wall is to protect us because otherwise, these irrational people, blah, blah, blah. And you don't get to see it. Like if people who are in, and one of the things that gets me about a lot of the tours that go to Jerusalem, so they're there for a lot of the holy sites, and they're going on tours and whatnot there. When the Israelis in 67 annexed a huge swath of territory around Jerusalem to create its new United Jerusalem. These areas were not originally Jerusalem, but they made they annexed a bunch of territory. One of the things they took in was a refugee camp from 48. And that refugee camp is inside the legal borders of Israel as far as Israel is concerned, not the rest of the world, right? So its law should apply. It's a concentration camp. It's literally completely surrounded by razor wire. There's one way in and out. Well, there's technically two, but the other one's always closed. And you're walking through one of those really narrow gate things on either side of you that's angled up. You can't get away, so they can watch you coming in from the sniper towers. It's literally inside the capital city. And people who live there. This is
which one is that, Liam?
Shuafat. The Shuafat refugee camp is attached to the town of Shuafat. It's basically they started building on from the town, and this area was sucked in, and people don't see it because you go to Jerusalem, but you don't see all of it. If you just walk a little bit north of the old city, you're heading into Shuafat. From Shuafat, here's the refugee camp, and you can see people living their entire lives surrounded. I mean, the fences are one thing, but on the other side of the fence, if you hop the fence, it's like massive coils of razor wire that'll just shred you. So you are trapped in there growing up. And American tourists won't see that. Birthright's not going to take you into Shuafat. Christian tours are not going to take you into Shuafat. So you're right. And both the local culture stuff, like going to the restaurants, that's great. But there's things to see that people don't want you to see. And that gets really complicated.
Go ahead, Riley.
No, I would say the only thing too is like the State Department kind of plays into that as well, right? Because there's areas we weren't supposed to go, right? There's a lot of things like we weren't allowed to go into the West Bank, at least the Palestinian territories part of the West Bank, right? So there's U.S. State Department. Yeah, it was. They're pretty. Again, it's all the safety stuff, right? It's unsafe, and maybe there's an element of it, right? I mean, again, I don't hold it back if I have diplomatic plates on my car, right, and something happens just because people are frustrated. Like I can see like there's this vicious cycle. But that was the thing where we were really frustrated. We wanted to go to like Hebron and Ramallah and just all these places and see. We never even went to Bethlehem just because it was too much of a hassle. And so there's a lot of stuff. Even there's forces within the State Department that kind of keep you from really seeing and experiencing.
And that's just because, okay, so the diplomatic plates part I get, but even if you're hitching a ride with somebody else, you can't go just because of like the visa you're on.
You got to get
special
permission. Yeah, and so like I wouldn't have done. I think if my friends, if they would come back and visit Palestine, I probably would try to find to go with them. But I also didn't want to get in trouble. But I think those are things. So you hear these stories, and we were reading stuff, but I mean, I was kind of getting inundated with. And I learned. They sent me to Hebrew language training before I went, so I became fluent in Hebrew while I was there, which was a really cool, neat experience to kind of unlock the culture. And I think that as a white guy, everyone just assumed I was an American Jew, right? That I kind of immigrated in, and so like it was an interesting experience for me because I think, most other countries, I wouldn't have been treated the same way. I would have been treated as kind of a little bit more of an outsider, but I got a lot more of the, speaking Hebrew. I was able to integrate. We lived on the economy. We had, we lived in we didn't really have any American friends, so all of our friends were either Israeli or from other countries. So I really kind of felt like I kind of felt Israeli, to be honest with you. The language, the culture, I loved it. Like just the whole thing. It just felt great. There was this cool feeling of being part of it, which I think was what made. Well, one thing, I think part of that, like I kind of that kind of like prevented me from really looking into some of the, one, not being able to go to some of these places and interact with people as deeply as I would have liked to, right? Like in the West Bank, and two, just kind of my Israeli friends, the culture, the language, kind of like liking just there's like this edge to Israeli culture that I liked. I liked the kind of the person I was as a Hebrew speaking Riley, and so I think it kind of I didn't see some of the downsides until after October 7th and Netanyahu coming back into power, becoming more right wing, and then just the crackdowns October 7th and just the response, and it just became clearer and clearer. I think about a month after, it's like, wow, this is really bad, and this is not getting any better anytime soon. And so that prompted the path of like I was already disillusioned with the Air Force in a lot of regards. We could talk more about that, but that's kind of the push of like, this is something I definitely can't get behind from the U.S. military. And then unfortunately, it went way farther it's gone way farther than I ever thought it would. And so I think the continued deterioration caused me to go public. May, June timeframe is when kind of I finished all the getting out of the process. Is like, hey, I actually want to say something. I don't want to just be the quiet person who's quit. I know a lot of people have done that. And then, I just still can't believe that, after everything, we're still just greenlighting arms deals with no conditions to Israel to continue genocide. So like, it just keeps getting worse. Unfortunately, it's just this weird thing. And so, I mean, it's been good for me because it's like, stronger and stronger. Like, I really believe in this stuff. I need to speak more out about it. So it's kind of emboldened me to continue to say like, this is wrong. And so I appreciate, platforms like you guys give me opportunity to share my story, and hopefully we can collectively bring this genocide to an end.
Okay, so you're talking about the way people treated you, just showing up there. Okay, white American. Everyone's going to assume you're Ole, and like, okay, cool. You're come on in. And I had that experience in tons of places. Just walk into random grocery stores trying to pick things up, and they were just they're like welcoming you like you've just come over, and you get a very different sense of what things are really like. But I would, at the same time, I'm interacting with people. I've gotten rusty, but I was conversant in Hebrew, so I'm walking around, chatting people up and just hanging out, and they're going to assume things, and I'm Jewish, so that kind of helps a little bit too, so I understand where they're coming from in a lot of this stuff, but at the same time, I was couch surfing through refugee camps and living in the West Bank. And at one point, I spent a whole summer living in East Jerusalem. And then another one, I spent a month up in like Nablus area. There's very different experiences you get in the two places, and it's interesting what helps people to notice that. And I like that you pointed out, because this is something that I think is really important to what Jamal and I have been trying to do in a lot of the public discussions on this kind of stuff, is help the people who are confused, because suddenly they're seeing things. They're seeing things on TikTok and Instagram, and people, live streaming horrifying shit. And they're like, this is not what I was taught this country is. This is not what I heard from the media or the government or anybody else or from my church or something. And they have questions about why it's like that. And there's so much that gets complicated about that gets, well, maybe it's just Netanyahu or just this, just that. There's so many layers to this, that your moment of noticing that, I'd love to hear something else about that, if possible, before and then Jamal can jump in with something. But how did that happen, or how did that feel? Because going from, hi, I can hang out with people and work with them, and I'm in the country and I'm just totally comfortable here, and then suddenly, what?
This is why Liam and I do this show, because I was thinking of that exact same question. You ever been in a class and someone steals your question? We're doing ESP.
The mind meld happened.
Look, this is how we do it on this show. He knew exactly what I would ask, because I take notes. Liam just memorizes this stuff. Go for it, Riley.
Well, I think, if the genesis of your question is like, how did the dissonance maybe between like what, like you go on one side of the green line and one the other side, and like there's two different worlds. I think the military, for had a lot of positive things out of the military, but I think one of the downsides is, especially the global war on terror, was just the dehumanization of Arabs, Muslims, right? Just how the Bush administration and subsequent administrations kind of justified the level of atrocities we did to the Iraqis and then Afghanis. And I think there's an element of just like you kind of internalize the dehumanization, and I think there's an element of there's very prevalent within broader Israeli culture. Is just, it's horrible what's happening, but there's a lot of just kind of cliche stuff that gets thrown around a lot and just gets said so much it becomes it just kind of gets, I guess it's hard not to have it sink in a little bit, right? So it just stuff is like, again, the terrorist thing, that's kind of, but even like historically, like the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I don't know if you've heard that one before, right? There's this stuff where there's just kind of victim blaming, bad mismanagement, right? Kind of ad hominem attacks, all this stuff. And so I think like on an individual level, I think it's something actually someone, there's a lot, I mean, this is all hindsight. I wish I saw that more when I was there, but I think a thing I noticed a lot is Israel's a very hard place to live. Like Israel proper, it's very expensive. Cost of living is high, taxes are high. People are working 6 days a week, multiple jobs. And so I think there's just a grind to Israeli culture of like people who got their heads down and they're trying to make ends meet. And I think there's a lot of similarities to American culture today as well, right? Capitalism such that you're squeezing the middle class. People are, they need healthcare, they need all these things. And so a lot of people would talk about it, but I think they're so busy just trying to make ends meet that they didn't have necessarily the bandwidth, nor were they're afraid of, if they were ostracized, right, of losing kind of their means of survival. And so I think that's kind of the thing. I think that's how the distance plays out. Is I think people want to care about it, but at the end of the day, it's like I got to put food on the table for my family. And so I think it's easier to not think about some of these things, or I can justify it maybe. And I don't know. That's kind of what I noticed, right? Does that answer your question, Liam? Is that kind of where you're getting at?
Oh yeah. The dissonance there, and I think it's important to connect it to. Okay, so from the military standpoint, where you're coming from, you're knee deep in that war on terror stuff, and there is a lot of, in many cases, conscious but also unconscious biases and dehumanization that shows up in that, and a kind of fear mongering because it sort of fits. You mentioned was a grandparent that was in Vietnam. I mean, you end up with the similar kind of thing where you don't know who the enemy is because they can stash the Kalashnikov in a basket, put on the hat, and I'm just a farmer, and it freaks people out and they snap and they're dehumanizing people. The same thing happens in a war on terror because they're unconventional wars, and that really messes with the people who are told to go and do the fighting. So I'm glad you're seeing that, you're coming from that lens, coming from you're hearing all of this stuff, and then you start seeing or meeting people and realizing it's more complicated than that. Like I love the, go ahead.
No, I agree with you. Like, I think the thing I realized, I've never been one who just likes the simple answers. It kind of drove me nuts. So I think the thing I did, where I probably was wrong, honestly, is I thought I kind of fell into the it's complicated on both sides camp. And I think that's kind of where I was probably until, October 6th, 20, or maybe whatever, shortly after. It's like, hey, listen, I like the nuances of the conflict, right? And I think it was hard in a sense, right? Because the Holocaust was a horrible thing, right? And I can see, I was able to see, honestly, actually while I was there, is like, people are using Jewish trauma for political power, and it didn't sit right with me. And it was really hard. Like, I also like the whole anti-Semitic kind of like attack of like, if you criticize a country, that like really annoyed me. But it was like power. It was kind of taboo enough that I didn't really say anything too much out loud. But like you start learning about like, neo or fascism, right, in the 1930s, and you start like there's a lot of similarities in Israel, and then it's like being in Israel, watching the election of Donald Trump and the Christian right kind of come behind it. It's like that's really when I saw like, wow, there's a lot of scary tendencies in our own country back 2016, 2017. And so it was kind of interesting being removed, right? Being, I no longer identify as an evangelical, just because I think that's been so tainted by kind of conservative right-wing Christian nationalist politics. But being, a Christian, I was a part of a Messianic Jewish congregation in Israel, but seeing how they kind of were falling into these Christian nationalism traps within, Zionist kind of circles in Israel, and seeing that same kind of mirrored in the U.S. was also a really fascinating experience to me for a while. I was able to be removed and kind of outside looking in, as well as the military, right? Like being kind of 2 years kind of off the grid and looking back at stuff really kind of gave me a new perspective on a lot of different things.
Yeah, it's interesting because.
Go ahead. I was actually going to ask you to bring something up.
Are you going to forget, or are you good?
Oh, I was going to say, based on that, I have something I want to talk about with the fascism lens, but I was actually going to ask Jamal, the Christian lens, I think, on this is very important, especially since people tend now to to stereotype a lot of evangelicals, and there are actually a lot of evangelical leftists and genuinely kind-hearted people who take the text very seriously, but there's also a massive Christian far right, and it tends to affect the way we talk about a lot of these issues. So I was wondering if Jamal wanted to bring that up too, and see how that affects the way people look at things, or your experiences there too.
Yeah, a couple things. I'm glad you asked that, Liam, because, one, I think you mentioned a couple things earlier, Riley, and you, Liam, as well, is that there's this orchestrated aspect of seeing what Israel is, what East Jerusalem was, the West Bank, and what Gaza is. It's very orchestrated. But there's also a sense of blind obedience. And I think, a lot of the Israelis fall victim to that. And I think once you're integrated into their system as part of the military, a lot of what we do in the military is blind obedience sometimes, unless you question the status quo. So I'm glad you brought that up. My experience with Christians just in our community has been silence. As a matter of fact, if I recall a conversation when this first popped off back in October, November last year, I called my pastor. And now this is a pastor that was on tour in Israel proper, visited Nazareth, lived with a few Palestinian families, but never got the full picture because his trip was orchestrated. And I said, hey, he's a very, very boisterous individual. Anytime there's an issue within the country, he's got a PhD in leadership, did his dissertation on Martin Luther King, a huge advocate, and would write narratives about the impact that some adverse actions happen. So I called him, I said, I wanted to ask your opinion on what's happening in Gaza. And it was pretty traumatic at the time. And his response to me was, it's a complex issue. I don't know much about it. Like, wait a minute. You're a pastor, you're Christian, you got a PhD in leadership, Martin Luther King dissertation, yet this is a complex issue. And what's interesting is that same church we used to go to, the other pastor sent out a message that she eventually recanted that said, pray for Israel, pray for Israel. That was it. Nothing about the Palestinians. And so she retracted that message, and yet a large majority of these individuals within the community and by and large continue to stay silent. So I put a message together that and put it on several social media apps, but didn't get a lot of traction. Like, shame on you for not speaking up at any given point. So I feel because of evangelical Christians who I think remind me if I'm wrong, Leo, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea of Zionism, they were the catalyst behind it prior to Herzl, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so we see a lot of that in today's society across the country. And I think there was one senator that says, if you curse Israel, you will be cursed yourself. I mean, there's that belief, that strong belief, no matter how many people you murder, if you curse Israel, you'll be cursed. So I don't believe that there's a lot of strong Christians out in our country that would not advocate for Israel. They feel that the Palestinians are primarily terrorists. They're all Muslim. I'm a Christian. They're Christian Palestinians. But that's how we've been portrayed, whether it's been in the movies, whether it's been in the Western media. So I do believe that narrative has to change, and it has to change through these platforms. People also coming out and talking more about the current situation. And it's not really that complex, man. I thought it was, but forcing me to take a deep dive into understanding what's been happening in the last 14 months has opened my eyes to say, the only reason it's complex, it's because you choose to make it as such.
Yeah.
Anyone wanting to
100%.
learn something new makes it complex.
Yeah, it's not that hard. If you take people's line, that's wrong. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's kind of like, it's, my 5-year-old gets it she's pretty savvy on the whole situation. So it's, but no, I think the thing, Jamal, is a really interesting point. So it wasn't a church, it was a Messianic Jewish congregation, but the pastor was actually Palestinian Israeli, but he kind of went full Zionist, right? It was just so strange. There's a lot of like Arabic speaking Christians in our congregation in Haifa that were Zionists, right? And to the point of like, wait a minute, there's Christians in Bethlehem, there's Christians in, like, not all Palestinians are Muslim, right? There's a proud, Jerusalem, etc. Like, so it's okay to take a fellow brother or sister in Christ's house and leave them homeless. Like, how does that make sense? Doesn't make any sense at all, right? Those are the things where I was just like, I kind of, it never sat well with me. But also I think there were so many, I guess I kind of got sucked into a bunch of I don't know, like just meeting people and kind of like it's like it happens now. It's like life happens, you get, you know, interpersonal stuff, and then you find out someone like posts something crazy on Facebook. You're like, that's so strange. You know, like they seem like a normal person. I think there's a lot of those dynamics of this weird kind of like the system level oppression, but then on an individual level, you can, you know, I met a lot of people I really enjoy that I don't have a relationship with now, obviously, but yeah,
Yeah,
it's very, it's so frustrating. I think to the point is the silence of Christians in the face of like harm that they're part of causing.
and Riley, you're not the only one that got sucked into the talking points. I remember having a conversation with a relative who lives there, and this was about a couple of months in. And guys, I literally, and I love my family, but I'm like, oh my God, these are Zionist talking points.
Yeah,
They were, because it's blind obedience. That's all they get fed in Israel proper. It's like Zionist talking points. Like, wait a
it's a
minute,
tough place.
you see what's happening, and it's like, and he's spewing this stuff, and I'm like, okay, this is the first. You know, I'm not going to call them anymore because I don't want any adverse impacts to them. And I walked away thinking, oh my God, it doesn't matter who you are. If you live in Israel proper, for the most part, you're sucked into these talking points.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and
it's
it's
tough.
interesting the Christian role on both sides of this, because while Christians are a minority in Palestine now, they have always been there. They're some of the very first Christians that ever existed, and those communities are quite old. And it's astonishing to me that so many American, European, and Christians in Israel as well can look down on Palestinian identity and roots and ties to the land completely. And Palestinians have been, I mean, gosh, the founder of the Popular Front, George Habash was Christian. I mean, Christians have been involved in resistance to Zionism from the start, people on the ground. But outside Christians, and Jamal was quite right, it was called Restorationism originally, but the idea of sending Jews back to Palestine started in Protestant Christianity, from taking the Hebrew Bible literally. They belong there. God gave it to them. They have to be there. And then over time, more apocalyptic ideals begin developing that specifically require that to be the case, that there be a Jewish kingdom on the land in order for the apocalypse to happen. That's largely a 19th century development, but earlier 19th century. And it also, those trends predate Zionism. So there was always a push by outside Christians to get Jews there that has a genocidal element to it because of the apocalypse. But it's also interesting that people can look at the Christians who live there and are experiencing this. I love that you said it's not complex, because while there's tons of nuance and tons of detail in all this, you can spend a lifetime studying this. At the end of the day, it's colonialism. And I deal with it in my class on Orientalism and imperialism as an example of colonialism, no different from India and Algeria and South Africa, the United States, tons of places where people have gone in and violently dispossessed the people who were there. But we somehow treat this one differently. And I think that Christianity is one of the main reasons that we treat this as fundamentally differently from other forms of colonialism.
And I think part of that is U.S. influence. I mean, you think about the other countries you just mentioned, there wasn't a lot of U.S. influence in terms of avoiding the topic. I think that stems by, I mean, most administrations that by and large have supported Israel from the get-go. I don't think there was a lot that didn't. Riley, to you, I know, I was in the military, active duty reserves for a long period of time. And earlier I talked about, really blind obedience to a certain extent. Obviously, if you needed to voice concerns, you could up the chain of command. What sort of backlash did you receive when you started talking or speaking up about what you were seeing that was different than what you actually believed at this point? Like, okay, now something's not right here. Any backlash that you received from fellow officers, fellow military personnel?
No, I mean, I found it kind of awkward. Like, it was super important to me. I think just because of my ties to Israel, living there, like I was watching way closer than most people were. And I think my wife, I have to give her a lot of credit, was following people, because we become more like tied into like activists and spaces, and you start to see how, white supremacy and colonialism and all these different kind of systems are overlapping, right? Like these seem kind of the playbook, as it were, revealed. So we were kind of primed in a way to have access through primarily Instagram to people on the ground getting kind of the truth. Whereas I think a lot of people, just the nature of our media ecosystem, a lot of people were not necessarily getting the raw, unfiltered, what was on TikTok and Instagram. They were getting more of the sterilized New York Times version of, passive voice in, a couple of blown up buildings. So anyway, I think a lot of people I talked with this to, where I was like, hey, this is super messed up. And people were like, oh yeah, that's awful. And that's kind of all where it went. So it was weird. It was like less pushback. Like I really wish people would have been more kind of aggressive. It was more just kind of like somewhat apathetic. Or like, I think there's an element of like, okay, yeah, that's awful, but like, what can I do about it? Right.
I was going to say, yeah.
I remember talking to my commander. This is like a week after October 7th. And I was just like, I just, that whole week I knew, or when October 7th, I had a huge pit in my stomach. Cause like, this is not going to be like the level of scale, and kind of based on kind of my convenient sample of friends and what they were saying, like the vitriol and malice in their words in these texts is like, oh, there's going to be a significant backlash. Like Israel's going to lay the hammer down on Gaza, which is what they did. And so I just had this pit in my stomach knowing it was, so I started calling. I think a couple of days after there was that ceasefire resolution put forward by like Rashida Tlaib, right? There was kind of this initial push of like, hey, let's get a ceasefire, and like this is not the way to get the hostages back, et cetera. And so calling congressmen and calling senators and trying to do like the civic duty thing, and like nothing's happening. I'm making multiple calls a day, et cetera. And so I remember sitting down with my commander, like, hey, listen, 2 weeks into this thing, it's not looking great, right? This is right as Biden goes like the big, bear hug, they bomb the hospital. Is there anything else like within the military chain that can I like since I technically work for, Biden, I'm like 10 layers below on the org chart or whatever, but is there a way within kind of the DoD to let people know like, hey, there's dissent within the ranks, like we don't approve of this. And he's like, unfortunately, you don't have to obey an unlawful order, right? So if I'm asking you to do something that's going to break, you don't have to do that. But like, there's other than that, like since you're not directly involved, like there's nothing like you do your civic duty as a citizen of the U.S. But that's it. So that was really dissatisfying to me. And I think I kind of realized that there wasn't going to be any recourse within kind of like official channels to like make anything happen. And so, but I didn't really think about like going public or talking to the media, just because I'm not a very, I'm kind of, I just didn't think about that until Harrison Mann, who was an Army major, was the first one from the DoD to have an open letter. And I saw that and I was like, oh, wow, this is something that resonates with me. And so that's kind of what kickstarted the process of going public and saying like, hey, this is something I'm concerned about, because I think it is important to know that there's a lot of people in the military who are uncomfortable with it. Even if maybe they don't feel quite to the extent that I would, that they would go public or resign.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Riley. I think part of it is, yes, we know what are we going to do, and I think that the lack of ability to engage in actions that will change the narrative. I recall reading, I think even from this is Israeli government experience during the Sabra Shatila massacre, that a lot of the conscripts, a lot of the reserves signed petitions not to serve anymore as a result of the atrocities that were happening. As you reflect on your experience, I know a lot of military personnel, as they're getting close to retirement, they look out for their benefits, they look out for their pension. Were there any folks in your group or other groups that were concerned about speaking out as a result of kind of the loss of pension, loss of VA benefits, things of that nature?
I don't know if that was the case. I think I don't know. I think our individualistic culture is really powerful in a way that prevents people from acting collectively. I think that's a big thing, right? Is I think people didn't see that this something affects them as well. Right. That this is it kind of sucks that it happened. And then maybe we've been desensitized. I have a good buddy he was pretty upset about it as well. He has basically 3 more years kind of a contract where he did some schooling. And so he can't get out unless he wants to, unless he pays it back essentially. So he had some, like there's the forces there that like he couldn't get out. I think he's going to get out once he can, right? And so short of like being a conscientious objector, there's really no method. And so I think there's a lot of that within the service as well, right? whether it's medical insurance or just means of life. There's a lot of ways that people get trapped into serving the military. And I heard an interview from a retired general talking about how people don't fight for patriotism anymore. We're essentially just it's an army of we're mercenaries. And I kind of honestly to some degree I felt that way too when I started off. It was very patriotic, right? Serve my country post 9/11, and then as I get longer and longer, I realized I'm just doing this. It's like a friends with benefits thing, right? Like this is something I'm helping the government, but the military's helping me. Like they're paying for my school. I'm getting good opportunities. And so I think that's, the transaction nature of it.
Yeah, that's our vision, right? Right. That's what we see in front of us. And you're right. I think to the point where if you're contracted and you're paid a certain amount of money to go through the schooling, do you really want to pay it back, or do you just want to stay silent on a topic that you may not have influence on? And so I appreciate that. Liam, any other questions before I move on, or any other thoughts? I would love to hear about your experience in Haifa, because I know he's talked about being there. So if we want to come back to that.
Yeah, we could definitely come back to that later too. I liked you mentioned the mercenary aspect. I mean, a lot of people love putting to Smedley Butler and the realization that all these deployments somehow seem to benefit an American corporation. And piecing that together is hard because, I mean, people go into the military often for the right reasons. They want to serve their country. They hear the stories. They understand. Okay, my country needs me. I'm going to step up. And then you start to wonder, why am I here, right? And thinking about the level of corruption and all the no bid contracts for rebuilding in Iraq, the fact that prior to the 2003 war, Iraqi oil was nationalized. They got to keep the profits from that. And afterwards, oh gosh, a whole bunch of foreign corporations now control the oil flowing out of there. It's not that it's just about oil. There's so much money to be made in these things. And that is an element of this stuff that doesn't get discussed often enough, I think, because there's a tendency, I think, with the people who often do know about this to then blame the people who did it, to attack people serving in the military, to say, you're baby killers and all that kind of shit, which I don't think is helpful at all, because people, again, they go in for the right reasons, but we are not given the full story on any of this stuff growing up in this country. You don't hear all this stuff. And I think that there needs to be a lot more conversation publicly to understand a lot of those issues.
Yeah, 100%. I was in the acquisition career field, right? So I was working where both R&D, but also testing. I was in the flight test. So testing stuff, basically we're the homework graders, right? So, a company makes an airplane or a product, we go out and fly it and make sure that they live up to contract. And there's a lot of times where they didn't meet the contract and they're getting paid anyway, right? Just because what else are you going to do? And certain military contractors almost spend more money on lawyers and program managers than they do in engineering. And they'd be willing to spend twice as much to litigate something as they would to fix a problem. So I think there's a lot of seeing some of that and seeing all the glossy brochure and the advertising, it's for the war fighter and yada yada, and it's no, really it's for the corporate, it's for the shareholders, and that was abundantly clear to me. And so I just felt very kind of jaded from some of that too, right? It's people, the good Americans, right, working really hard to try to do their job, and at the end of the day, it's corporate profits that take the front seat.
Right, and oftentimes American lives get lost for that too. I saw it I came to college and then academia later in life. And my last position in IT was working in a small aerospace company. And I worked with tons of engineers that came out of Northrop and Lockheed and whatnot, out of Boeing and Douglas. And they would talk about exactly that issue. It will cost X amount of money to repair this fault that has been identified. But if X number of planes crash every so many years, then it will cost this much in lawsuits. That's a smaller number. Okay, cool. Then don't fix the problem. And you just casually write off those. It's it's an actuarial issue at the end of the day. They just,
it totally is.
They're going to figure out, okay.
And it's super short-sighted.
Count on that many lives being lost. And that's a lot of people, again, go into the military with a kind of patriotic idealism, and they don't understand how we're being used. And I think that there's not enough conversation that I think is welcoming to people to help spread that and get people to understand this stuff better. Instead, it ends up being a lot of toxic discourse that can alienate the people who have went in with those ideals.
Yeah, and something, Jamal, I want to go back to something you said, just kind of as far as like getting pushback. And I think the thing that was frustrating to me is realize like how many people agreed with me, right? Like you look at polls and say like 76% or whatever want a ceasefire, 50 something percent people think it's a genocide, right? Like a majority of Americans, like 76%, at one point it was like 3/4 of all Americans were like, we want a ceasefire, right? And you're like, how have we missed, like no one, there's a few loud voices, obviously, but I mean, like how are we missing the average person is like, this is, I don't want to spend any more money on a foreign war, right? This is like, you think it'd be pretty straightforward politically. And it just, I guess it shows you kind of how bought and paid for our politicians are, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I think that was something that was really frustrating with me as well.
And I don't think our politicians work for their constituents. They work for other countries, and they work for their own profits and greed. I truly don't. They're rare that you have politicians that work for their constituents. Yeah, they don't work for
lobbyists are for countries, most of them for corporations, different special interests, but they work for the people who are paying for their elections, and that's not us.
Yeah, and I remember when I was in the financial service industry, I would fly out to Sacramento, represent the institution, and lobby for certain regulations or certain things that we wanted to introduce, and we would speak with senators and Congress people to talk about, hey, this is what we're implementing. We really need your advocacy. It was crazy. It wasn't about the constituents. It was more about what they can implement in terms of strategy, products, so that they can gain more profits. I mean, look, when this next tax cut expires, I think 2025, and the idea was to reduce corporate taxes to 21% from 35%, yet to disseminate some of the earnings down to their employees. That shit didn't happen. All they're doing is reinvesting in the company to broaden their product lines or broaden their digital transformation and other facets of the business. So yeah, I don't know if there is a politician out there, very rare, that are working for the constituents. And if they are, they've been squeezed out through various lobbying groups. So
yeah, the sad thing is that lobbying, in principle, is a good idea in a democracy because the people in office oftentimes are disconnected from the concerns of ordinary people. It was the idea of catching someone in a lobby and saying, hi, I'm in your district and we have this like toxic water or whatever kind of issue. We need that fixed. And, oh, okay, cool. But it became very quickly in the 19th century, hi, I've got this issue. Here's a wad of cash. Please do what we want. And all we did was we took away, they can't hand them envelopes anymore. They can say, here, you can use my bungalow in Tahiti, or here's like $20,000 for your reelection campaign or to a PAC that's going to support you. Please pass this legislation. It's become very toxic and all based around money. But it was supposed to be about actually getting the concerns of constituents heard in the first place. And there's a point you raised much earlier that I think we can connect to or dovetail from this, if that's all right. You mentioned Israeli working hours. And this is also something we don't pay as much attention to, largely because it's a consequence of the neoliberal economic turn in the 70s and 80s. And the Israelis were an early adopter of that. And they went from like 80% of Israelis were part of a labor union to completely liberalizing the economy, switching to finance capitalism. Rents went way the hell up. The cost of living went way the hell up. Israelis today have some of the longest working hours in the world, alongside like the US, Japan. There's a few countries that work themselves to the bone. And other people like in, say, Germany are like, hey, we've got you're working a few hundred hours more than we are. What is wrong with you? And they do really well for themselves. There's something wrong with the system that does that. And Israelis in 2011, alongside like the Arab uprisings, alongside the protests in Turkey, in the US with the Occupy movement, they were out in the streets in Israel. I participated in like, little tent encampments, talking to people, what are the issues here? And in hearing people talk about working 60 hours to afford a closet in Tel Aviv, because they just could not get ahead. And I think one of the key elements of the current situation we have in Israel, in Israeli politics, is tied not just to the racism and situation with the Palestinians. It's tied to the economy, and the economy drives neo-fascism. It's the same thing that we're seeing across many countries in Europe, where the economy begins to liberalize, things get more insecure for people, they start listening to demagogues. That happened in the US, it's happened in Israel. Far-right candidates do well, not just because of the racism, but because of those work hours and how hard it is to get ahead. The Israeli dream is dead. And those are people too that we should be able to talk to, that we should be able to help them see, like, you're supporting the people who are actually making this worse. But just like a lot of people in the US, that they fall for the story and don't know the policy. They don't know that you get this with people like Trump too, who's singing a song and dance about how tariffs are going to bring jobs back, but it's literally impossible as long as capital can cross borders. You can't close a border to goods by raising the prices if capital flows can still move around. It won't help us. All it will do is make some corporations much richer and raise the cost of living for working class Americans. But you don't get that story. You don't get the full economic picture in the sound bites on TV. And Israelis are just as much a victim to that as anybody else.
Liam and Riley, maybe you can also piggyback on this. So you talked about, the cost of living being expensive in Israel, and I won't compare it to the U.S., although obviously cost of goods right now are really high because of past inflation. But if you cost of living is high, but isn't it true that they get free medical, free tuition, and who does if that is the case? I mean, because that's all I hear compared to us, where we have to pay for medical. We have to pay for education. How is that, comparatively speaking to the U.S.? Yes, you work 60 hours a week, but I get free healthcare and free education. So, isn't that why most people do birthright, because of land acquisition, healthcare, education?
Yeah, because I wasn't on the actual Israeli healthcare system, I kind of went through the U.S. still. But yes, it is paid for. College is much cheaper. It's an economy of scale thing too, though, right? I think there's like 6 or 7 million people in Israel proper, right?
Right.
The numbers are much more manageable from that perspective. But rents are significantly higher, right? Land is there's a lot less land, so you're paying like Liam said. I think Tel Aviv might be the most expensive city in the world. If not, it's routinely in the top 5. So it's hard to say. Most people don't have one car, maybe, right? So just the level of goods you have access to, it's a simpler lifestyle. So some of the finer things are a lot more expensive. So I think you can trick yourself in America, right? Because you can buy a big car, you can get a loan and get a nice house, you can have all the toys, put it on the credit card, and then obviously your healthcare is crap. But I think from an outside looking, it looks a lot more manageable. So I think Israelis maybe have conditioned themselves to be a little bit more on the simpler side, more which I really liked. I like that people took public transportation. I like that people walked. I like that people were not as there wasn't as much fraudulent materialism, I think, that there is in the United States. But on balance, I think it's much more expensive to live in Israel than in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting in that they can play on some of that pioneer ethos of a simpler lifestyle that worked in tons of other settler colonies before, and used to be very important to Americans too. Prior to the 20th century, when we started praising businessmen and salesmen, like the good hardworking farmer, the homesteader was like the American hero in tons of our fiction and whatnot. And the Israelis do make a lot out of that. But it's interesting to think that the early generations there were determined to actually build a really high standard of living. And a lot of what Israel has today is based on that work, but it's declining in the same way that it is for the US. People aren't noticing as much. You mentioned credit. We don't notice as much, but our living standards have been going down. And it's something that people in certain situations will notice more. Yeah, Tel Aviv is not like on the level of Moscow or London, but it is an extremely expensive place to live. But Jamal's right. They do have healthcare. Public transport is very cheap. So there's a lot of things that we don't have that they can take advantage of, that do make things a little easier. Even as a non-Israeli, as an American, I was in Israeli hospitals a few times. You know, at one point I got severely dehydrated and sick, and I ended up in hospital there. It was dirt cheap. You know, something that would have cost me thousands of dollars in the U.S. 100 shekels, cool, whatever. I'm out, and like it was nothing. Like it cost me almost nothing to get treated there, because they actually do put some money into a few areas, but it also has a lot of those same downsides, you know, as, you know, say like, you know, the London real estate market, things like that, because of some major shifts. And there's the working hours again are still high. Salaries are going down. It's getting a lot harder for people. And that is what opens them up to far right politics, because people will sell them a song and a dance about how it'll fix things for them. And until you include the economics lens in that, we're not going to be able to get rid. I mean, honestly, if Netanyahu goes, we may get somebody much worse. You know, there's the overall trend politically there is not favorable, and it's not just the Palestinian issue.
And by the way, Riley, depending on which report you look in, Liam, Tel Aviv ranks anywhere from 8 to 16. I think it's Singapore, Hong Kong, and others. And Zurich is actually the richest, the most expensive. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, no, but yeah, top 10, yeah, 8 to, it definitely checks. I mean,
it's expensive, nonetheless.
Much worse than the U.S. in general. I mean, we have higher medical and transport and everything else costs, but, you know, property is definitely cheaper here, and that squeezes people a lot. You know, people's rent and housing payments are a significant part of your outgo.
You say cheaper here, but people would tend to disagree with you. It's expensive, relatively speaking. It's much less expensive. But to buy a house,
exactly.
Sure.
On specific issues, I mean, housing is definitely not. I mean, there's a reason I live pretty far out from the cities. It's much cheaper, but again, compared to some places, it's much worse. No, we got San Francisco is highly ranked, you know, in terms of its cost.
It's crazy. According to pay structure, it's considered zero in terms of the ranking, because it's the highest. It's one of the most expensive places to live in California, so you have to get paid more to live there. And I don't think that's even enough. You know, Riley, for you, you know, when you think about what you've learned over the course of, you know, the last year, I know you've been on various platforms advocating for the Palestinians, speaking out against the genocide and what our government's doing. What's in line for you? What's next?
As far as this issue?
Yeah. How else are you kind of advocating? What steps are you taking? I know you have a lot on your plate with family, but would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for me is just continue to speak more and more. I think sometimes it's almost easier to go on a podcast or go on MSNBC than to like talk to your uncle, right? Everyone's got that uncle. And so I think there's an element of just like working with, I mean, most of my family's still, you know, Christian, evangelical, right? There's a lot of pushback kind of internally. And so it's kind of twofold, right? Just people I love and care about, or friends I interact with, coworkers I continue to speak. Sometimes it's the kind of the undignified maybe work of just like talking and keeping this issue to people who wouldn't be paying attention to it. And then as opportunities present themselves, right? I think my story is somewhat unique, and so being able to share it to hopefully show that it's not, you can be, you know, someone in the military who thinks that genocide is wrong, right? Like, and I don't know, it's having the courage. It's like continuing to have more and more courage to just be bolder about what's happening. Because, yeah, and I think, I mean, I said this in the AJ Plus piece, is like our liberation's bound up together, right? I went to, my birthday was July 24th, and so I spent my birthday going to DC with my wife to protest Netanyahu's speech to a joint session of Congress. And
good for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fortunately, again, I have the means and the ability, and we were able to travel for that, and it was really eye-opening to me to walk. We walked around the Capitol. There was a demonstration that we kind of marched around, and they gated. There's probably like a 3-mile perimeter around the Capitol. They bussed over 200, I think almost 300 NYPD officers down. They were Capitol guards. Like the level of security for a peaceful protest saying we shouldn't have a war criminal speak to a joint session of Congress was like probably 4x what was there for January 6th during the insurrection. And seeing these police officers in full battle rattle, pepper spraying people, like it was really dystopian. And I don't think it got reported very much. I think there was some reporting, someone like, spray painted something at Union Station, like Hamas, or I don't know, whatever. It was a total like, red herring. But to see kind of the weaponization of the police, which I kind of saw during the student protests, right, the encampments, and like how vicious the police has been, understanding more of the history of policing in this country, but then kind of experiencing it firsthand as someone, right, who like wore a uniform to protect this country, to see people who also take a similar oath to protect the country, right, protect the people, being turned to,
you turn weapons against the people
exactly. It was just, it was really, really dystopian. And like, I looked at these people, and I don't necessarily, to Liam's earlier point, like, I don't have hatred towards these individual officers. I think at the end of the day, these are jobs. People are trying to feed their family. It's like there's a system level issue here, and there's a narrative that people are believing that like someone like me is the bad guy. I love,
which is wild, right? Which is wild. Like, why?
Yeah, no.
Why do you believe that? And it's institutionalized, right? It's institutionalized.
Air Force veteran, right? Someone who served my country, right? Like I was a company man for 12 years and said I can't do this anymore. I love Macklemore's song "Hins Hall," both of them. But the problem is the protest is what they're protesting, right? Like there's something, and I think the thing is like not one of us isn't going to solve this problem, right? There's this collective. We have to take care of each other.
Absolutely.
And I think there's an element of like, again, just you study the Holocaust. I mean, people like to quote it on both sides, but it's like what happened. I just think of myself, like Nazi Germany, right, in 1930s. I would have probably been, I don't want to be the good German person who turns the church that turns the music up so we don't hear the trains going by, right? We learned about the Jim Crow South. Aaron Bushnell, who was an Air Force airman who self-immolated back in February, that was, I kind of jumped around my timeline, but that was an event that really, really hit me pretty hard.
And I think you mentioned something, Riley, earlier that we can't lose sight of. We often think that change requires abundance and action.
Yeah.
But it's the individual conversations that also add so much value, whether you're talking to your uncle, to your aunt, to a friend, a coworker. I was in a class, I teach Muay Thai, I teach kickboxing, and one of the students who I've known for a while now said his wife is Jewish, he's not. And he said, we're having a conversation. He said, try walking into Gaza if you're part of the LGBTQ community and you'll be thrown off roofs or this. I'm like, no, that is such a distortion of information. And I had to correct it because there was another person listening. I'm like, no, that's not really what happens. Even if I'm Christian walking in, I'm not going to have anything happen to me. That's what you've learned from Western media all these years. Misconception. And so honestly, those conversations are valuable.
Even if that was true, let's say they're throwing, queer people off buildings in Gaza. That means you can just bomb the hell out of Gaza. Again, the premise itself is like, that's my thing is like there's all these weird talking points. There's like, at some point, killing innocent people is wrong, right? Sniping kids in the head is wrong. And like, I don't care what that person did. There's just like retributive violence. I think, I bought into it too, right? We can 9/11, we'll just go blow off some terrorists and that's going to bring justice. And it's like, no, it just brings more pain and suffering. And I think that's what we're seeing here in spades is this is just hurting everyone, right? It's
absolutely
no one's winning. And so we have to turn the tide. But lastly, to Aaron Bushnell's point, his final words, his final Facebook post is basically like, what do you think you would do during, Nazi Germany, during apartheid South Africa, during the Jim Crow South, like you're doing it right now. And so that was before I told some people I was getting out. I usually use that I'm getting out for a bunch of reasons, right? I kind of hid behind it a little bit more as far as like, it wasn't like super out there as far as I'm doing it because I'm disgusted with the Biden administration's policy in Gaza. And so that was just a reminder of like, hey, like what would I do? I have little kids, right? What do I want them when they're older? And hopefully we're learning about this in the history books. It's something that happened a long time ago. Like I want to be one of those people that says they were the minority that said, hey, I'm not going to stand for it.
Yeah, I love that. I so appreciate that perspective because I have 4 children myself, and I've been in their ear about this from day one. And my oldest went to ministry school out in Northern California. My daughter does missionary work. My son they're all very faith-based. And, I try to make sure that they understand that there is a certain part of Christianity that advocates for these actions. And there is a part that you all need to stand up for and say, no, this is not what Christianity is all about, right? It's not, Jesus wouldn't have said go genocide a whole population because of one day. And so just make sure you understand that. And so I appreciate you standing up for the Palestinians, because when you stand up for the Palestinians, I think it impacts globally all marginalized groups. We're not all free, and we're not all free until all of us are free, right? And so I think that's essential to make sure that you're an example for your children, and they'll remember that, especially sadly when this is written in the history books. And I hope it is really showcased as to the U.S.'s involvement in this Israeli government's atrocities. So I appreciate that. We're over the hour, so I want to be respectful of your time, Riley. Liam, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we depart?
Yeah, there was one quick one. I think that there's like a story in question that I want to bring up, just because, again, Riley was in Haifa for a while, and I think that might be a nice way to wind this down. But just also, though, Jamal, too, on this, the whole like tossing people off roofs kind of nonsense. I mean, there's literally a public queer cafe in Ramallah. But there's a good book on queer life in Palestine that you might want to consider for the book club. It's actually relatively short. It wouldn't have occurred to me, but Riley's comment made me think that maybe we could talk about that at some point and let people know this is a lot. There's a lot more nuance than people think. And yeah, there are conservatives there who hate that, but they're here too.
Of course.
People are murdered in the U.S. for being queer too, so it's not like it's unique. But okay, so Riley, you mentioned the difficulty of talking to like family and neighbors, right? Yeah. And I totally get that. It's some of the most important work that we can do, because people who know us take us more seriously than people listen to, like, strangers on the internet. It's a different dynamic, and it is easier for people to come out of that, but it is very difficult. And I think that there's an example of that in Haifa, that the way that people can be sort of blind to things that are just right in front of them. I was based at the university there for a while, so I really got to know an Arabic language instructor. So she teaches Arabic at university for a living. And I found out accidentally in a conversation one day that she does not understand Palestinian Arabic, that she doesn't understand the way people actually speak. She only understands Fusa. So she's literally unable to talk to people. And I'm saying, okay, well, it's not like this is like, Moroccan Tarisha. It's not like it's that different. You can just walk down to Wadi Nisnas and you can talk to people and pick up the differences. Just spend some time chatting with people and you'll figure this stuff out really fast. Because, and she looked at me and her eyes bugged out and she said, "But I'm a Jew." Like, it was shocking to her that she walked to a neighborhood over and talked to people who live in the same city and are citizens of the same country. And moments like that really helped me to understand how important it is to have those personal relationships, to talk to people, to actually see and humanize somebody, to understand their story, which you don't just get from media type stuff. So I figured, since you've lived in the city and you've seen some of the interactions there in a mixed city there, if you had anything that you wanted to share on that too,
No, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, Haifa is they kind of pride themselves in being like the melting pot of Israel, right? Like, they've got Christian and Muslim and Arab and Jewish communities, all kind of. But to your point, is it's not really interspersed. They're all kind of these little enclaves of these things that are tucked away, right? So there's these ultra Orthodox neighborhoods. They've got. Anyway, so it's like there's like these pockets, but it's not as like this utopian as they kind of they want to make it sound. But I think there is an element to it. It's cool. I mean, I didn't have the same kind of like aversions to any of these different neighborhoods. So like going to the Wadi and going to these, buying some food there. We always liked it too because they were open on Shabbat, right? So on Saturdays, it's nice having all of the Arab Christians or the Palestinian, well, they call themselves Arab, right? But the Palestinians there, the grocery stores are always good to be open, and the bakeries and Saturdays. So that was kind of a fun thing. But no, I think getting to know people personally is like, once you humanize people, to kind of bring it full circle, like, it's a game changer, right? Because then it's hard to justify doing anything, let alone just, genociding people if they're humans.
Yeah, and
I got to ask you.
one of the things Jamal and I are trying to do is just help people understand these are human beings. And
yeah.
please take that seriously. I mean, they're not all terrorists. There are children and old people, and just people are just being buried in rubble that we won't find for months or years, and that's okay. I don't understand why that's okay.
It's sad. It's pathetic. And you know, I'm hoping that through this work, what we do and others do, really put an emphasis on education. I think there's such a great opportunity for that. And I know it takes time. And so we appreciate you spending that with us today, Riley. I do have a question for you. Did you eat knafe at Nablus, one of the best places to eat knafe?
But
shut the front door. Oh my God. The cheese, you like it with cheese, right? Really? Or I'm sorry, khishne, like rough on top or smooth?
The orange stuff on top.
So whenever you're in LA, you got to come out. My wife makes great knafe. My daughter makes great cinnabuns, crumble cake, cookies, you name it. That'll be on us, man. Just hit me up whenever you're in LA. This, you know, first of all, again, let me just, on behalf of Liam, thank you, man, for spending time with me. I know you didn't know me other than that TikTok live, but I appreciate you trusting us and coming to our show. As you can see, Liam's got one of his cats with him. We always have extra bodies here on the show, so we love it.
Yeah.
Continue. Let me know if you ever need anything, Riley. But go ahead. Did you want to say something before I wrap us?
Nope. Sorry. I thought it was me. No, I'm good. Thanks for the time. I appreciate the work you guys are doing, and it's always fun to talk about this stuff. I love talking. I mean, it's nice. It's almost like I really enjoyed my time in Israel, and it's kind of been very obviously tainted, and so it's kind of nice to relive some of the things, and hopefully through a more positive light.
We will. I appreciate you, man.
Honestly,
go ahead,
it
Liam.
would be nice. I mean, just I don't know. It's a utopian fantasy here. It'd be fun to actually to go there, like get a group. We could all go and see things, and you don't have the restriction now. We could actually go into the West. We could go up to Nablus. It'd be lovely.
As long as I'm not on any list.
And then again, find like those human elements. Make it a little better, because a lot of this stuff really does taint things. But there is a lot of beauty all across that land. Physically, the people, the places, the food, and it's worth remembering just the human lives, all over the place on this, and the people caught up in that.
All right, thanks, gents.
Have a great night, man. Take care, guys. This is it, episode 16. Thank you, Riley Livermore. Appreciate your time. God bless. Let me know if you ever need anything from us. We're here for you, man. Appreciate your support. Fight on.